The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. No more extensions. That's the message from U.S. President Trump as he draws a hard line on trade, declaring that the tariff suspension will end on August 1st. And countries that haven't signed a deal with the U.S. will face steep penalties. This isn't just economic policy, it's power politics. With the courts backing him, Congress largely silent, and his party firmly in line, Trump is wielding tariffs as both a negotiating tool and a show of dominance. But the 90 deals in 90 days promise has delivered just 2 so far. So what's really going on here? What's behind Trump's hard line on the August 1st deadline? Will he actually stick to it, or is another extension still on the table? Will countries fold under the pressure or simply bid their time? To help us unpack all of this is Kevin Chen, who's an Associate Research Fellow with the U.S. program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Hongbin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Kevin, what do you think is the strategic calculus behind Trump's hard line on the August 1st deadline?
Well, to be entirely frank, I'm not really convinced that the deadline is set in stone. Well, Mr. Trump has a tendency to make statements sometimes without necessarily following up. Just look at what he said about Ukraine, for example. The equipment supply for them was on, then it's off, then it's on again. We might yet see Secretary Bessent or Lutnick come out to clarify what, the chief executive meant over the next day or so. But let's just say that, Trump means what he says this time. I think there would be 2 parts to it. So first is the letters that Trump sent out to 14 countries yesterday. They can be thought of as warning shots, trying to show that he's very serious about implementing tariffs if he's not satisfied with the progress in the negotiations. That's probably why the tariff rates are roughly similar to those that he announced on Liberation Day back in April. Although, Malaysia ended up with a rate that's about 1% higher at 25% instead of 24%. In addition, it's clear that Trump wants a political victory with these tariffs. The framework with China and the deals with the UK and Vietnam, they're nice, but not quite the 90 deals in 90 days that were promised. By firing these warning shots and then doubling down on the hard August 1st deadline, he's seizing the narrative and he's aiming to put himself in a position to declare that he pressured the countries into deals that benefit America. Now, at the same time, I think it's interesting that, parties that were reportedly close to reaching deals with Washington, including India and the European Union, did not receive letters from Trump on the tariff rates they are facing. This, could mean that they are really, really close to the deals, which seems to be the case with the EU. Or they could also receive letters later this week. We'll have to wait and see.
But why do you think this U-turn now, despite the previous night saying that he is not 100% firm on his August 1st deadline?
Frankly, I think it's partly because of Trump's awareness of the taco moniker that's floating around, the one that says Trump always chickens out. He didn't take kindly to the reporter who asked him about what it meant, and I imagine that he still wants to project an image of strength. So it was probably why he made that post on Truth Social. The question is whether investors and other observers believe his tariff threats. There are letters circulating from firms like Capital Economics, AJ Bell, saying that, Trump was giving himself more breathing space already by delaying that initial July 9th deadline. And, he might yet back down from pulling the trigger on August 1st.
So, you did mention that you're not buying this whole thing. So could we expect him to extend the deadline again?
Well, far be it from me to guess what Trump is going to do next. But I think what's going to happen is that we will see some tariffs come into effect on August 1st, especially if those countries are not close to reaching a deal with U.S. trade officials. Whether these will still be at the same level as the Liberation Day tariff announcement, that's unclear. After all, we saw the tariff rates ascribed to Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia come down significantly in the letters that were sent out, despite countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand being very close to deals, and their rates didn't drop at all. When it comes to countries that are very close to reaching a deal with the U.S., I think Trump might also choose to extend the deadline from them because he would understand that it would jeopardize ongoing talks if suddenly, they're nearly at the finish line and then suddenly they're slapped with a full tariff rate. Of course, it's also entirely possible that Trump might just let the hammer fall and have all the tariffs come into effect, regardless of the status of the talks at the time. I think the bigger question is what's going to happen after August 1st. Will there be a situation like when the tariffs were initially implemented in April, and then suddenly paused, where Bessent and Lutnick convinced Trump to institute the 90-day pause while Peter Navarro was busy? Or are the tariffs going to stay? It's difficult to tell what's going to happen next. But,
Right.
Investment firms especially seem to be counting that Trump will back down.
I mean, with the extra 3-week extension paired with Trump signaling that he was still negotiating additional deals, this has fueled speculation among some in Washington and on Wall Street that the president would not follow through on his latest tariff threats. Could Trump retract his tariff threats altogether, Kevin?
No, I doubt he's going to retract them altogether. He's too much of a supporter of the utility of tariffs as a negotiating tool,
Right.
not just for trade, but for broader political and security-related issues. Now, he might scale them back and give the excuse that countries gave him what he demanded, but no, I don't think he's going to give them up entirely.
Okay. Well, do you think countries will see this and call Trump's bluff, or are we likely to see a wave of rushed bilateral deals before the deadline?
Well, whether countries believe Trump will carry out his tariff threats or not, they are unlikely to want to risk being, hit with the full force of the Liberation Day tariff rates for their country. We've already seen, economists in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and others warning that the tariff rates that were threatened back then could shave up to 1% of their respective GDPs for 2025. So yes, we are likely to see these countries push for deals with Washington just over the past week or two. We've seen countries increase their offers. Thailand, for example, they pledged to balance their trade with the U.S. within 7 to 8 years instead of a decade. Indonesia announced a $34 billion pact to buy U.S. products and invest in U.S. energy and manufacturing. I expect to see their deals, as well as the deal with Malaysia, being announced over the next few weeks.
Okay. Well, I mean, imposing higher duties on U.S.-bound shipments arguably gives Trump a domestic win in line with his, America First narrative and bid to rejuvenate U.S. manufacturing. But Yale Budget Lab says U.S. consumers now face a 17.6% effective tariff rate, the highest since 1934, after Trump's new tariffs on several countries. So, Kevin, do you think these tariffs are really helping the U.S. economy, or could they hurt consumers more than they help government revenue? Is Trump's strategy doing more harm than good?
Well, first off, I think we need to take a step back and look at the economic goals of the tariffs. Trump wants to first generate revenue, second, balance the U.S. trade accounts, third, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and fourth, use the tariffs as a negotiating tool. For the moment, I would say that it is generating revenue. If the deals say what they say, they will help to balance the trade accounts to an extent. I think 4 is definitely proven as well, given how the countries have so readily come to the negotiating table. Well, that remains to be seen. For the moment, inflation levels at the U.S. appear to be holding steady, dropping below the level that it was when Trump took office in January. That said, many economists feel that it's a matter of time until price pressures from these tariffs make themselves felt on the U.S. economy. The effective U.S. tariff rate, like you mentioned, 17.6% right now. It was 15.5% not too long ago, and 2.5% at the end of 2024. Yeah, I think most economists would feel that something has to give.
Right.
And then, that said, though, there's, like I said just now, the revenue-generating ability of these tariffs. Yes, they do generate revenue. Treasury Secretary Bessent estimated that the U.S. would generate about $300 billion in tariff revenue in 2025. And there are also estimates by the Congressional Budget Office that the tariffs would reduce the deficit the U.S. has by roughly $2.5 trillion from fiscal 2025 to 2035, almost the same as the addition to the deficit via the One Big Beautiful Bill that was recently passed. Of course, this would be at the cost of shrinking the U.S. economy, increasing inflation, but we'll have to see. These are estimates, and much remains to be seen.
Okay.
That all being said, though, I think the broad picture is more important as well. Well, it's important as well. The tariffs will harm the U.S.'s leadership in international trade issues, leaving them out of emerging trade deals and conversations. Even if internal economic indicators remain stable, the tariffs will exact costs on the U.S.'s international position.
So could higher duties likely deepen mistrust among close allies and trading partners, in turn eroding U.S. global leadership?
Absolutely. And I think the concern that's been raised by our government here in Singapore and governments around the region as well all speak to that. The U.S. has been slowly retreating from trade leadership in this region since its withdrawal from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, back in January 2017. But there's a marked difference between leaving the global trading order it created and working to undermine that very same order via tariffs and other related actions. Now, countries are probably not going to cut the US out of their trade links entirely. They're still going to trade with the US, but they will move to diversify who they trade with, reducing their reliance and their vulnerability to future tariff approaches.
Well, what risks do U.S. allies face in navigating Trump's unpredictable tariff regime, especially countries like Japan, Korea, or even India that are balancing between the U.S. and China?
I mean, on the one hand, you've got obviously the economic risks, but I think there's also a domestic political risk to consider as well. We saw the Japanese trade delegation. They tried their best to make a deal with Washington. They were one of the first countries to begin talks with Washington after Liberation Day. Japan's envoy, I think he made about 7 trips to Washington to talk to Trump and other officials. They did all that. And then the July 7th letter came and threatened them with a rate of 25%, 1% higher than the rate that was threatened in April. It's going to be challenging for governments of U.S. allies to continue their engagement if they don't see much in return, given the domestic shock that, the tariffs are going to cause. Japan has upper house elections on July 20th, and Prime Minister Ishiba needs to show that he's not conceding too much to Washington for nothing in return. Now, that's domestic, but looking internationally, there are risks from China as well. Beijing has previously threatened countermeasures against countries that strike deals with Washington at China's expense. And the country that comes to mind right now, that people are looking at right now, is Vietnam, because of the inclusion of the whole thing about transshipping in this deal and how it would get a 40% tariff instead of a 20% tariff. So it's something that countries are going to have to watch out for while they try and strike trade deals with the U.S.
Okay. Well, then what do you think Trump really wants to achieve before the August 1st deadline?
Well, he wants victories. He wants to be vindicated for his support for tariffs from day one. But I also think Trump genuinely subscribes to a mercantilist view of global trade, where a trade deficit is not a natural result of comparative advantages, but it's an unacceptable weakness that must be addressed. So Trump wants promises to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and for other countries to invest heavily in the U.S.
Well, on that note, Kevin, Trump's administration had previously promised 90 deals in 90 days after the president unveiled an array of country-specific duties back in early April. So far, only 2 agreements have been reached with the United Kingdom and Vietnam. So what does this gap tell us about the feasibility of Trump's bilateral trade strategy?
I think it tells us that despite initial optimistic statements, trade deals, they're not very easy to accomplish. These are very technical, complex documents, often needing to balance between being exhaustive and lenient, so trade is governed within reasonable limits. It took years for agreements like the U.S.-South Korea FTA and the bilateral FTA to be finalized. Finishing 90 deals in 90 days, that was always going to be a tall order, if not an impossible one, especially with a reduced staff after all the reforms by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Now, to give Trump credit, he was right that countries would do just about anything to avoid the worst of the tariff rates. The utility of tariffs as a negotiating tool has been made pretty clear over the past few months. However, I would say that Trump was a bit too optimistic of the time scale of his strategy, shall we say.
So with the slow pace of deals here, how much leverage does the U.S. actually have in these negotiations? And is the threat of tariffs proving effective or counterproductive? To what extent, Kevin, are countries actually folding under tariff threats?
I think here we need to differentiate between what investors believe and what governments fear. In the market, the belief in, taco or Trump always chickens out. It's taken hold since the initial tariff pause in April, and we can still see the market performing decently well despite new tariff threats because they expect Trump to back down from them. However, the U.S. still retains a great deal of leverage over its partners in the short term because governments, they're less willing to call Trump's bluff, not when, their country's economic prospects and their own political fortunes are at stake. So we will see them make pretty generous offers to the U.S., including removing tariff barriers, promising to buy more products, investing more in the U.S., and the like. But this leverage, it will probably diminish over the years as countries move to diversify their trade links and reduce their reliance on the US market after this episode.
So, does Trump's dominance at home paired with near total control over trade policy give him more leverage over countries than during his first term, you think?
I would say that it does give him more leverage over most countries, the exception being China. China has learned from the experience of the first trade war. They understand the critical nodes of the U.S. supply chain for critical minerals, rare earths, given that they control 90% of the world's supply of rare earths like dysprosium and terbium. The situation was so dire back in June that major automakers in the U.S. like Ford were forced to shut factories or face broader shutdowns within weeks if nothing was done. So Trump still has significant leverage over smaller countries that depend on the U.S. export market to fuel their manufacturing industry and such, but not China. To borrow Trump saying, he doesn't hold the cards when it comes to Beijing.
So with the courts, Congress, and his own party mostly backing him and tariffs now his go-to move, who, if anyone, can actually rein Trump in? I mean, is Trump unstoppable?
Well, yeah, I read that article this morning as well in the Straits Times. There are, I would say, a few branching thoughts on this issue beyond just talking about domestic politics. I think there are quite a few observers who expect the bond market to exert a limited amount of restraint over Trump, especially if indicators such as the 5-year and 10-year Treasury yields rise above 4.5, maybe even 5%. A surge in those yields would signify an erosion of confidence in U.S. economic prospects. But then again, there's no guarantee that this will influence Trump. There's also the possibility that his advisors or even the segments that he listens to on Fox News could help to influence his course of action. That's what reportedly led him to, implement that tariff pause back in April after Besant and Lutnick spoke with him. But I think the really frightening prospect is that these aren't proper reins. These are just, momentary developments that pop up. When it comes to can anyone actually rein Trump in, I think the frightening answer is normally no.
Wow. All right. Well, before we let you go here, Kevin, what will you be looking out for ahead of the 1st August deadline?
I'll be looking out for details of the new deals with other countries as they're announced. I'll be looking at the tariff rates that Trump imposes on other countries, whether they're the same or different from those imposed on Liberation Day, how they measure up to their partners or their neighbors, especially within Southeast Asia. But I'll also be looking to beyond those to see what governments are doing beyond their engagement with just Washington. We're already seeing ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, look further afield to the Middle East to secure deeper trade links with the Gulf Cooperation Council, or upgrading existing linkages with China to upgrade their free trade agreement to FTA 3.0. I expect more of these to happen leading up to the August deadline, but also beyond that, probably around the time of the ASEAN summit. And frankly, that might be the biggest story as the 1st August deadline for the tariffs comes and goes.
Some great insights and analysis from you there. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That was Kevin Chen, Associate Research Fellow with the U.S. program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.